A lavish Christmas gala turns deadly quiet when a powerful millionaire loses his temper and kicks his pregnant wife to the floor in front of a stunned crowd. The music stops, cameras flash, and every secret he's tried to hide begins to unravel. But just when he thinks he's untouchable, the doors swing open, and her father walks in dressed as Santa, ready to deliver a justice no one saw coming. What follows is a story of power, betrayal, and cold, unstoppable revenge. Tell me what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from, and drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. The ballroom at the Riviera Grand shimmered with gold light and the kind of forced joy that only expensive people know how to fake. Music floated through the air, violins and laughter weaving into one polished sound, while waiters carried trays of champagne that no one really drank but everyone held for appearance. Near the 12-foot Christmas tree, Claire Whitman smiled, as if her world hadn't been slowly collapsing for months. Her soft sky-blue gown caught the reflections of the ornaments, her 7-month belly round and perfect under the glittering lights. She looked like peace itself, though inside, her chest was tight with the quiet panic of pretending everything was fine. She felt the baby shift beneath her ribs, a small reminder that she wasn't alone in this room full of strangers. Ethan Hale stood across the ballroom surrounded by investors, his laughter too loud, his hand too familiar on the arm of his assistant, Ava Cross. The woman in the crimson dress turned every head as she leaned in to whisper something that made Ethan smirk. Claire saw it all from a distance, the way his shoulders relaxed with her, the way he never looked that warm when speaking to his own wife. She told herself not to stare, not to make a scene, but her gaze kept drifting back like a bruise she couldn't stop touching. The champagne in her hand trembled slightly. Someone nearby mentioned Ethan's name with reverence, the kind of tone people reserve for men who own too much. Claire swallowed hard, her throat dry despite the drink. She had become invisible in a room built to celebrate her husband. When Ethan's eyes finally found hers, they weren't kind. They never were in public. His smile didn't reach them. He excused himself from the group and crossed the marble floor with quiet, deliberate steps. His cologne arrived before he did, that sharp, expensive scent that once meant safety but now only meant control. "What are you doing standing here by yourself?" he asked, voice low enough to sound intimate but cold enough to sting. Claire steadied her breathing. "Just getting some air," she replied softly. Ethan's jaw flexed. "You look like you're sulking." "Don't embarrass me tonight." She tried to smile, the way she always did when he used that word, embarrass, as if her existence had to fit perfectly into the image he'd built for them. "I'm fine," she whispered. "I'm just tired." But Ava had drifted closer, pretending not to listen while obviously doing exactly that. "She's glowing," Ava said sweetly, her tone sugared with venom. "Pregnancy suits her, doesn't it?" Ethan chuckled without warmth, and Claire caught the quick exchange of glances between them, the kind that said more than words ever could. "Thank you," Claire murmured, turning away, but Ava's voice followed like perfume. "Careful near the tree, dear. Wouldn't want to trip in front of the cameras." The insult was soft, almost polite, but it landed hard. Claire felt heat rush to her cheeks. Ethan's smile faded as if he too heard the sharpness underneath. But instead of defending his wife, he exhaled with irritation. "You always take everything personally," he muttered. "Can you just enjoy the evening?" Her voice broke before she could stop it. "She insulted me, Ethan, in front of everyone." His eyes darkened, not with concern but with warning. "Lower your voice." He leaned closer, his breath against her ear. "You're making a scene." Around them, the music swelled again, guests pretending not to notice the tension. Claire tried to step back, but his hand closed around her wrist, firm, controlling, not yet cruel but close. "Let go," she whispered, glancing at the cameras pointed their way. "People are watching." Ethan's fingers tightened, then released, his smile snapping back into place. "Then smile," he hissed. "That's what they came to see." She did. "Because that's what you do when your husband owns the air you breathe." She smiled for the cameras, for the investors, for the ghost of the woman she used to be. The lights shimmered around her, the orchestra sliding into another elegant carol, the sound of wealth filling every corner. And for one small moment, she almost convinced herself that she was safe again, that this was just another uncomfortable evening in a marriage built on appearances. Then Ava laughed too loudly near the bar, her red dress catching the light, and something in Ethan's face changed. His eyes sharpened, jaw set. He muttered something about controlling yourself, and before she could move or speak, the world tilted. There was no warning, just the sudden force of his shoe connecting with her hip, a hard, deliberate motion that cut through the music like a blade. The impact sent her backward into the Christmas tree. Ornaments shattered on marble, gold and red fragments scattering across the floor like spilled blood. The music stopped mid-note. Gasps filled the room. Claire fell, instinctively wrapping her arms around her belly, protecting the only part of her life that still felt pure. Her head hit the floor with a dull thud, the scent of pine and champagne and fear closing in around her. For a moment, she couldn't hear anything but her own heartbeat, fast and uneven. She looked up through blurred vision and saw Ethan standing above her. His fists were clenched. His face was red, not with shame, but with anger. He didn't reach for her. He didn't speak. He just stared. Somewhere, someone whispered her name. The cameras had turned. Dozens of eyes, dozens of lenses capturing the exact moment a man of power became a monster in a tuxedo. Claire tried to sit up, pain slicing through her side. She whispered, "I'm okay," though she wasn't. She needed to believe the words, needed her baby to believe them too. Then the doors burst open. A gust of cold December air swept through, carrying flakes of snow that sparkled under the chandeliers. And from that white blur of winter stepped a man in a Santa Claus suit, red velvet and black boots, beard dusted with frost. His voice thundered through the silence. "What the hell is going on here?" Heads turned, whispers breaking like waves. The man tore off the fake beard, revealing a familiar face lined with age and fury. "Claire," he said, crossing the room with heavy steps. "Sweetheart, are you hurt?" Ethan froze. The room seemed to hold its breath. Claire blinked through tears, her voice small but certain. "Dad." Charles Whitman, the father she hadn't spoken to in years, knelt beside her, his strong hands trembling as he touched her shoulder. "He kicked you?" he asked quietly, though the answer was already written across her face. Claire nodded once. Her father's eyes rose to meet Ethan's, and in that look was decades of restrained power now unleashed. "You just ended your career, son. Lee?" The room stayed silent as Charles lifted his daughter gently from the floor, his red Santa coat brushing against the broken glass. Snowflakes swirled through the open doors, melting on the marble like tiny drops of mercy. Somewhere far away, a child's choir on the hotel speakers began to sing "Silent Night," soft and haunting. Claire closed her eyes against her father's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart, the warmth of a man who had come back just in time. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry, not from pain, not from fear, but from the strange relief of finally being seen. The silence after the kick did not last long. Within minutes, whispers turned into chaos, and chaos turned into spectacle. Phones rose like a forest of judgment, flashing lights cutting through the golden glow of the ballroom. Security moved uncertainly, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe, because no one knew how to react when power and violence collided in front of them. Charles Whitman, still wearing half the Santa suit, held his daughter in his arms and shouted for help, his voice trembling between fury and disbelief. "Call an ambulance now!" he barked, and people moved only when they realized he wasn't asking. Claire clung to his coat, her breath shallow, her mind looping through fragments of sound, the gasp, the silence, the breaking glass, the cold marble against her back. Her baby shifted weakly inside her. "It's okay," she whispered to no one in particular. "We're okay." Outside the hotel, the snow was falling harder, thick flakes spinning under the streetlights as sirens grew closer. The crowd had followed them to the lobby, faces pale with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Someone muttered, "Did you see it? He actually kicked her." Another voice replied, "I got the whole thing on video." Claire could hear the words even as she tried to block them out, each sentence landing like another bruise. Ethan stood a few feet away, still surrounded by his investors. His tie loosened, his expression shifting rapidly between anger and calculation. "It was an accident," he said to anyone who would listen, voice low but steady. "She slipped. You all saw the tree. She lost her balance." Charles turned his head sharply, his voice cutting through the room. "If you say one more word, I'll make sure you regret it." Ethan smirked but said nothing. For the first time, he looked small, his confidence stripped, his empire trembling under the weight of what had just happened. When the paramedics arrived, Claire barely noticed the cold metal of the stretcher or the flashing lights painting the snow red and blue. She focused only on her father's voice beside her, the way he said her name, the steady rhythm of it, grounding her in the blur of movement. "I'm here, sweetheart. You're safe now. Don't try to talk." She wanted to tell him she hadn't called him in years, that she never expected him to show up, that she still remembered their last argument about her marriage. But the words stayed trapped in her throat as the ambulance doors closed and the city lights flickered past the window. The siren's wail mixed with the pulse in her ears. She thought of the Christmas tree crashing behind her, the ornaments shattering like pieces of her old life. At the hospital, the world shrank to a narrow hallway of white walls and sterile smells. Nurses moved quickly, their shoes whispering against the tile, while a doctor in blue scrubs asked questions she could barely process. "Pain level? Any bleeding? How far along?" Claire answered softly, feeling detached, like she was watching someone else speak. Her father waited outside the examination room, pacing, his Santa coat draped over one arm. When the doctor finally emerged, his face carried that cautious, calm professionals wear when balancing truth and hope. "The baby's heartbeat is steady," he said, "but we'll need to keep her for observation overnight." Charles exhaled slowly, his eyes closing in relief. "Thank you, doctor." He stepped into the room and saw Claire lying there, pale but awake, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. "He could have killed you," he said quietly. Claire turned her head toward him, tears pooling in her eyes. "He already did," she whispered, "just not in the way you think." By morning, the city had changed. The video was everywhere, on news channels, in group chats, across every social feed that thrived on scandal. The headline read, "Millionaire assaults pregnant wife at Christmas gala." Clips looped endlessly, freezing the moment his foot lifted, the moment her body crumpled, the moment the room gasped. Strangers debated whether it was real or exaggerated, whether she provoked him, whether money would make it all disappear. Ethan released a statement through his publicist, calling the incident a tragic misunderstanding during a stressful evening. Claire watched it from her hospital bed, her pulse steady, her face unreadable. Her father stood behind her, arms crossed. "We can sue him," he said. "We can destroy him legally, financially, publicly." Claire shook her head slowly. "It's not about destroying him, Dad. It's about ending this." Grace arrived that afternoon, her soft features tight with worry. She sat beside her daughter, smoothing her hair the way she used to when Claire was a child with nightmares. "You're safe now," she murmured. "That's what matters." But Claire could see the exhaustion behind her mother's eyes, the fear that safety was temporary, that people like Ethan always found a way to twist the story. And she was right. By evening, new headlines appeared. Ethan Hale denies allegations, claims wife suffered stress-related episode. His legal team spoke of hormones, emotions, unstable behavior. Claire's face was framed beside his in split-screen contrast, the trembling wife and the composed businessman. The war had begun, and it was being fought in public. Charles paced the hospital hallway, phone pressed to his ear, his voice controlled but sharp. "I don't care about optics. I care about my daughter. Get me everything you can on him. Financial records, offshores, property titles." He hung up, his jaw tight. When he re-entered the room, Claire could sense the shift in him. The father who once warned her not to marry Ethan was gone. In his place stood the CEO who built empires and buried competitors. "He wants a fight," Charles said. "He'll get one." Claire closed her eyes, the sound of the fetal monitor steady in the background. "Dad, I don't want revenge," she murmured. "I just want peace." He looked at her for a long moment, his voice softening. "Then we'll get you peace, whatever it takes." That night, snow fell quietly outside the hospital window. The noise of reporters faded with distance, replaced by the hum of machines and the rhythmic beeping beside her bed. Claire watched the flakes drift down, each one distinct, fleeting, and gone. The baby moved gently beneath her hand, and for the first time since the party, she allowed herself to breathe without trembling. The world outside was burning with judgment and gossip, but in this room, everything was still. Her father had fallen asleep in the chair beside her, his gray hair tousled, his Santa jacket now a makeshift blanket. His presence filled the sterile space with something she hadn't felt in years: safety. In the early hours, the nurse came in for routine checks, her voice soft. "You're lucky," she said, adjusting the monitor. Claire gave a small, tired smile. "I know," but inside she didn't feel lucky. She felt hollow, scraped clean of illusions, stripped of the careful lies that had kept her marriage intact. She realized that what happened at the party hadn't just broken her body, it had freed her from the last thread of denial. The version of her life she'd built around Ethan's temper, his charm, his money, had shattered like those ornaments under the Christmas tree. What remained was raw and painful, but real. As dawn crept through the blinds, turning the room gold and gray, Claire whispered a quiet promise to herself. "This ends here." It wasn't anger that guided the words, but something steadier, quieter, almost sacred. She would not let fear raise her child. She would not let shame write her story. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and relentless, covering the city in silence. Claire closed her eyes and listened to the sound of her baby's heartbeat, steady and strong, the only music she needed to hear. When Claire woke the next morning, the hospital room was washed in a pale light that made everything look distant, as if she were still trapped inside a dream that refused to end. The beeping of the fetal monitor was the first sound she registered, followed by the slow rhythm of her father's breathing in the chair beside her. Charles Whitman had fallen asleep, sitting upright, still wearing the same suit from the night before, his tie loosened, his hands folded, as if even in rest he was guarding her. She stared at him for a long time, taking in the small details she hadn't noticed in years: the streaks of gray in his hair, the faint tremor in his fingers, the exhaustion of a man who had built his life on control, yet now found himself powerless against his daughter's pain. When he finally stirred, blinking awake, his voice was quiet. "You should be sleeping," Claire smiled faintly. "I did. I just wanted to make sure you were real." The doctor entered a few minutes later, carrying a clipboard and the careful calm of someone trained to balance truth with empathy. "Good morning," she said, glancing from Claire to Charles. "The baby's heartbeat looks strong, which is the best news we could hope for after a fall like that." Claire exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The doctor's voice softened. "But you need rest. No stress, no confrontation. Your body and your child have been through enough." Charles nodded quickly, as if to promise he'd protect her from everything that might cause another tremor in her pulse. But the doctor looked directly at Claire. "You'll also need to think about your next steps. This kind of incident doesn't just heal with time." Claire understood. The bruises would fade, but the memory would not. She murmured, "Thank you." And when the doctor left, the silence filled with unspoken things neither she nor her father knew how to say. Grace arrived not long after, her eyes red but her posture steady, carrying a paper bag of homemade soup that no one had the appetite for. "I thought you might want something warm," she said, setting it on the small table by the window. She leaned over and kissed Claire's forehead, her hands lingering there like a blessing. "You scared us, sweetheart." Claire met her mother's gaze, saw the quiet strength that had always lived behind those gentle eyes. "I scared myself," she said softly. Grace looked at her husband, her expression weary but firm. "Charles, she needs calm, not headlines. You know what that means." He didn't answer right away. His attention was fixed on his phone, where the world outside was already tearing their private pain into a public story. "It's already out," he said finally. "There's no way to hide it now." He turned the screen so Claire could see the headline: "Millionaire's wife hospitalized after Christmas gala incident." Underneath, a blurred photo of her being carried out under flashing lights. She stared at it until her eyes burned. "They make it sound like an accident," she whispered. Her father's voice hardened. "It's not an accident when a man raises his foot to a woman, especially when she's carrying his child." The anger in him was volcanic, the kind that came from love and guilt combined. He had told her years ago not to marry Ethan Hale, had warned her that charm without compassion was a dangerous currency. But Claire had been younger then, dazzled by ambition, convinced she could love the arrogance out of him. She could still remember her father's exact words from that night in his office. "You can't fix a man who doesn't think he's broken." Now, as she lay in a hospital bed with bruises blooming across her skin, she finally understood. She looked at him, voice trembling. "You were right." He shook his head. "I wish I hadn't been." Later that afternoon, the nurse dimmed the lights, and the three of them sat together in near silence. The snow outside had slowed to a soft drift, each flake catching the light before melting against the window pane. The television mounted on the wall played muted news coverage of the gala incident, clips repeating over and over, a slow-motion replay of the moment Ethan's foot lifted, the moment everything broke. Claire turned away from the screen, pressing her palms against her belly. "He's still moving," she whispered. Her mother smiled through tears. "Of course he is. He's strong, just like his mother." Charles stood near the window, his reflection doubled against the glass, watching the city below with an expression that was both grief and resolve. "He'll try to spin this," he said quietly. "He'll claim stress or alcohol or misunderstanding. That's what men like him do. They buy their redemption." Claire's voice was hoarse. "I don't want to fight him in the press. I just want to live without fear." Her father turned from the window, his eyes fierce. "Then we fight privately, legally. I'll handle it." She nodded, too tired to argue, too broken to plan. For years she had been silent, moving through her marriage like a ghost haunting her own life. Now that silence was gone, replaced by a steady hum of anger that frightened her more than Ethan ever had. It wasn't the wild kind of anger that burned and vanished. It was quiet, measured, cold, the kind that knew it could wait for justice. When night came again, the hospital dimmed to a low glow. Claire lay awake, listening to the faint rhythmic sound of her child's heartbeat on the monitor. Her parents had gone home to rest, though she knew neither of them would sleep. Reporters had gathered outside, their cameras waiting for a glimpse, their questions sharp as knives. Every time a door opened, she tensed, half expecting Ethan to walk in with apologies and excuses, the kind that used to disarm her. But he didn't come. Instead, a nurse brought in her phone, which had been buzzing non-stop since morning. "You want this back?" she asked gently. Claire hesitated, then nodded. The first message was from Ethan. "I'm sorry. It was a misunderstanding. We can fix this." Then another. "You know I love you. Don't do anything stupid." And then, finally, the one that made her stomach turn. "If you talk to anyone, you'll regret it." She stared at the words for a long moment, then deleted them one by one. Her reflection on the dark phone screen stared back, calm and steady. She whispered to herself, "No more fear." She set the phone face down and closed her eyes. For a while, she simply breathed, letting the weight of the day settle where it belonged, outside her body, away from the fragile life she was protecting. In that stillness, she felt her father's promise and her mother's touch, two anchors in a storm that had almost drowned her. The child kicked again, a small pulse of life under her ribs. Claire smiled faintly through the ache. "We're safe now," she whispered. Not because it was entirely true, but because she needed it to be. The sound of the monitor blended with the quiet hum of machines and the wind against the window. It was a fragile kind of peace, the kind that exists between heartbreak and healing. Claire let her eyes drift open one last time to the faint reflection of snow outside. It was falling heavier now, soft and relentless, covering the streets, the noise, the headlines, everything that had once seemed impossible to escape. She imagined it blanketing the world in silence, washing it clean. For the first time in years, she felt something close to stillness settle inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet. Just the calm before a long, necessary reckoning. And as the snow kept falling, she let the rhythm of her child's heartbeat lull her to sleep. A quiet promise that life, against all odds, was still moving forward. Night had fallen over the city like a heavy curtain, the kind that muffles sound and makes even the brightest lights seem tired. In a dim office on the 32nd floor of a downtown high-rise, a woman sat alone at a desk littered with papers, her red dress crumpled, her mascara smudged. Ava Cross had always known that working for Ethan Hale came with danger, though not the kind written in contracts. For years, she had been his confidant, his secret keeper, the one who smiled at his parties and erased his mistakes before sunrise. But that night, as she scrolled through her phone and watched the news replay of the Christmas party scandal, her hands trembled. The image of Ethan's foot striking Claire's side froze on screen, and for the first time, Ava saw him not as a man in control but as something darker, something she had helped feed. The guilt burned quietly inside her. The office smelled of stale coffee and perfume, the air cold against her bare shoulders. She played the video again, lowering the volume, watching the frame-by-frame horror of it. There was no denying what she had witnessed, no way to spin it into misunderstanding. He had hurt his wife. And now, as reporters crowded outside his mansion and social media tore him apart, Ava realized how easily he could turn on her, too. She had files, messages, bank statements, proof of what he'd done long before that night. Offshore accounts under her name, fake companies, shell transactions that had kept his empire spotless, and her complicit. She whispered into the quiet, "You're not taking me down with you." But the words sounded weak, like a confession instead of a threat. Her phone rang, sharp and sudden. The name on the screen made her stomach drop. Ethan. For a moment, she thought about letting it ring out, but curiosity and fear were stronger than reason. She pressed answer, her voice small. "Ethan?" His tone was calm, too calm. "Where are you?" She swallowed. "At the office." A pause followed, long enough for her to feel the weight of it. "You shouldn't be there," he said. "People are talking. You and I need to be aligned. No surprises." Ava forced a laugh that cracked halfway through. "Aligned? They're saying you kicked your pregnant wife in front of the press. I don't think alignment is possible right now." He didn't respond immediately, and when he did, his voice had changed. "Delete everything. Every document. Every message. You know what I mean." Her pulse quickened. "I can't do that," she said quietly. "Not anymore." She could almost hear his smile through the silence. "Ava, don't make this harder than it has to be. You've benefited from me more than anyone. Think about that before you do something stupid." She hung up before he could finish, her breath uneven. For a long time, she just sat there staring at the city below, its lights flickering like distant fires. Then she moved quickly, unlocking a drawer and pulling out a flash drive. Years of files, neatly stored. Receipts, emails, wire transfers, and contracts she had copied without his knowledge. She had told herself it was insurance, but deep down she knew it was guilt disguised as caution. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, and somewhere in the building, a security alarm beeped softly before resetting. Ava packed her bag, tucking the drive into a small envelope, her movements quick and deliberate. When the elevator doors opened, her reflection looked foreign. Tired eyes, trembling lips, a woman who had built her life out of borrowed power and was now trying to survive it. In the lobby, the night guard nodded politely, unaware that the envelope in her purse held the end of one man's empire. She drove through the sleeping city with no destination at first, headlights slicing through the fog. Her thoughts drifted between fear and anger, guilt and self-preservation. Finally, she found herself parked outside a gated mansion she had only seen from the news, the Whitman estate. The gate lights flickered on, washing her car in a soft golden glow. She hesitated before stepping out, clutching the envelope to her chest. Her breath fogged in the cold air as she pressed the intercom button. "I need to speak to Charles Whitman," she said, her voice shaking. "It's about Ethan Hale." Inside, the guard on duty frowned but made the call. 10 minutes later, the gate buzzed open. Ava walked up the long driveway, her heels clicking softly against the stone path. The house loomed ahead, tall and silent, its windows glowing faintly like watchful eyes. Charles opened the door himself, wearing a plain gray sweater instead of the suit the world always saw him in. His expression was wary, almost tired. "Do I know you?" he asked. Ava hesitated. "Not personally, but you know who I worked for." That was enough. His shoulders stiffened. "Why are you here?" She took a deep breath. "Because I think I can help you destroy him." Leng. They sat in the study, the air heavy with the scent of old leather and wood polish. Ava placed the envelope on the table between them, her hands still trembling. "He used me," she said quietly. "I thought I was part of something powerful. But it's all lies, fraud, bribes, fake companies, and now he's trying to make me disappear with it." Charles studied her for a long moment before opening the envelope. As he scanned the documents, his face shifted from curiosity to cold focus. "These are bank records," he said. "Some of these accounts are under your name." She nodded. "He made me the face of it, but he controls it all. I kept copies because I knew one day this would happen." For the first time that night, Charles leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Why bring this to me?" he asked finally. "Because you're the only one who can stop him," she said. "You have power, money, reach. I just have the truth." He was silent for a long while, the only sound the crackling of the fireplace. Then he said quietly, "He didn't just hurt my daughter. He's been stealing from this city for years. Maybe it's time someone took everything from him." Ava looked up, meeting his gaze. "I'm not doing this for revenge," she whispered. "I just want to be free." Charles gave a small, grim smile. Freedom and justice sometimes walk the same road. As the clock struck midnight, the snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the tall windows. Charles sealed the envelope and locked it in his desk drawer. "We'll handle this properly," he said. "You'll have protection, and if what you've given me checks out, he'll never hurt another soul again." Ava nodded, her eyes glistening with something that looked like relief. She stood, smoothing her coat, and for a brief moment, the woman who had arrived trembling seemed to stand taller, lighter. "Thank you," she said. Charles walked her to the door, the faint echo of their footsteps following them down the hall. Outside, the driveway was covered in a thin layer of snow. Ava paused beside her car, glancing back at the mansion glowing softly through the storm. For the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't felt since before she met Ethan, clarity. She started the engine, the tires crunching over ice, and drove away into the quiet streets. Behind her, Charles stood by the window, watching the red taillights fade into the distance. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, his expression both weary and resolved. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't called in years. When the line connected, he simply said, "It's time." Then he hung up, turned off the lights, and let the room fall into silence. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the world in white, as if preparing it for something new to begin. The morning after Ava's visit began like any other in the Whitman household, quiet and deliberate, with the faint hum of coffee brewing and the steady rhythm of rain against the tall glass windows. But beneath that calm surface, something had shifted. Charles Whitman stood in his study long before sunrise. The envelope Ava had given him spread open across his desk. Pages of numbers, offshore transactions, fake invoices, and signed authorizations stared back at him like pieces of a puzzle that spelled corruption. He had seen enough deceit in his career to recognize a system built on greed. What chilled him was not the fraud itself, but the precision of it. Ethan Hale hadn't simply stolen money. He had built an empire on illusion. Every account, every transfer, every signature had been placed with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Charles read each document carefully, his hands steady, his mind clear. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "You thought you could play God," he murmured under his breath. "But you forgot there's always someone watching." By mid-morning, the rain had turned to sleet, the sky a dull shade of silver. Charles called his attorney, Sarah Chen, a woman whose voice carried the weight of certainty. "I need a full investigation," he said without preamble. "Financial fraud, bribery, tax evasion, everything you can find on Ethan Hale. I'll send over the files." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure you want to do this, Mr. Whitman?" she asked quietly. "This won't just destroy him. It'll drag your family into the public eye again." Charles looked out the window, watching droplets slide down the glass like slow tears. "He made that choice the moment he touched my daughter," he said. "Now I'll make mine." When he hung up, he felt an old part of himself awaken, the strategist, the builder, the man who had once stared down corporate sharks and won. This time, it wasn't about business. It was about blood. Across the city, Ethan Hale sat in his penthouse, the curtains drawn, his phone buzzing with messages he no longer wanted to read. His PR team had crafted statements. His lawyers had advised silence, and his investors were demanding explanations he couldn't afford to give. The brand he'd spent a decade building was crumbling in real time. "This is temporary," he muttered, pacing the marble floor. "It'll blow over." But even as he said it, he knew the words were hollow. The video from the Christmas party had spread beyond control, his name trending beside the words abuse and fraud. He poured himself another drink, the glass shaking in his hand. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered how much Ava had told. Then came the knock at the door. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made his chest tighten. When he opened it, A man in a dark suit handed him an envelope. "Mr. Hale," the man said, "you've been served." Ethan stared at the papers inside. Subpoena, investigation, asset freeze, and for the first time in years, he felt fear crawl up his spine. Meanwhile, Claire sat in the hospital garden, bundled in a blanket, her breath visible in the cool afternoon air. She had been allowed outside for the first time since the incident, and the freedom, though small, felt sacred. The world moved gently around her, the sound of nurses' shoes on pavement, the distant murmur of traffic, the soft rustle of winter branches. Her father joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, his expression softer than she remembered. "You look better today," he said, handing her one. She smiled faintly. "The doctors say the baby's strong. That's all that matters." He sat beside her, nodding. "You raised a storm, you know. People are watching. Some are angry, some are inspired." Claire took a sip, letting the warmth settle in her chest. "I didn't mean to raise anything," she said quietly. "I just didn't want to lie anymore." Her father looked at her, pride and sadness mixing in his gaze. "You didn't lie. You survived. That's different." In the following days, Charles's team worked quietly but relentlessly. Financial analysts pored over Ethan's accounts, tracing hidden money trails across continents. Every discovery felt like a small victory, every number, another weapon in a war for truth. Late one evening, Sarah Chen called from her office downtown. "It's worse than we thought," she said. "He's not just guilty of fraud. There are offshore holdings tied to shell charities, political kickbacks, even forged permits on construction sites." Charles closed his eyes for a moment, then said evenly, "Document everything. When we move publicly." He knew what that meant. Exposure, headlines, scandal, but also justice. Claire watched her father from a distance, sensing the quiet storm building behind his calm exterior. He didn't talk about what he was doing, but she could see it in the way his phone never stopped buzzing, in the fatigue that deepened the lines around his eyes. She wanted to tell him to stop, to let it go, to let the law handle it. But she also knew that wasn't who he was. For Charles Whitman, love was expressed through action, and revenge, if it came, would be delivered with precision, not rage. One evening, as he prepared to leave her room, she reached for his hand. "Don't lose yourself in this," she said softly. "You already got me back. That's enough." He smiled faintly, squeezing her fingers. "It's not about losing myself," he replied. "It's about making sure no one like him ever wins again." At the same time, Ethan's empire continued to crumble. Reporters dug deeper, old partners turned away, and investors began pulling out quietly. The sleek glass tower that bore his company's name suddenly felt colder, emptier. He stood by the window, staring at the skyline that had once symbolized his success. The city looked different now, indifferent, almost cruel. His assistant entered the room nervously. "Sir, the press is at the lobby again. They're asking about the financial reports." Ethan didn't turn around. "Tell them I have no comment." His reflection in the glass looked older, harsher, a man cornered by the ghosts he had created. That night, a single headline appeared across every major outlet. "Federal investigation targets Ethan Hale's real estate empire." The article cited whistleblower evidence, offshore accounts, and leaked documents from inside sources. Claire saw it on the hospital television, her heart racing. She looked at her father, who was standing near the window, his face unreadable. "You did this," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No, he did." The screen showed images of agents entering Ethan's offices, carrying boxes of files, seizing computers. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sound of rain against the glass filled the silence. When the footage ended, Claire turned off the TV and leaned back against her pillow, her eyes drifting toward the small crib beside her bed. Inside, a folded blanket waited for the baby she had promised to protect. She reached out and touched the fabric gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's over now." Her father watched her for a moment, then nodded. "For him, yes," he said. "But for us, it's the beginning of something better. You know?" The storm outside began to clear, the last drops of rain sliding down the window before disappearing into the dark. In the distance, city lights shimmered through the mist like quiet promises. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter. Charles stood beside his daughter, both of them silent, both of them knowing that justice was never clean but always necessary. And as the night settled around them, the rhythm of the monitors hummed softly in the background, steady, calm, alive, like a heartbeat that refused to break. The video began with silence, just Claire, sitting in a white hospital room, the sunlight spilling through half-closed blinds, the faint beeping of a heart monitor beside her. She wasn't wearing makeup, just a pale blue sweater that matched the sterile calm of the walls. Her hair was tied loosely, her eyes swollen from nights without sleep. When the camera light blinked on, she didn't flinch. She took a slow breath, her fingers resting gently on the swell of her stomach, and looked straight ahead, as if speaking not to the camera, but to someone sitting quietly in front of her. "My name is Claire Whitman," she said softly, her voice steady but fragile. "And I survived something I thought I never would." The words hung in the air for a long time before she continued. "If you're watching this, maybe you've been where I was. Maybe you've loved someone who hurt you and told yourself it was your fault. Maybe you believed them." Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes did. Behind her, the curtain moved slightly as the wind pressed against the glass. She spoke with a rhythm that came not from rehearsal but from honesty, each word careful, deliberate, true. "I used to think silence was strength, that keeping peace meant keeping quiet. But silence only protects the person who caused the pain." She paused, looking down for a moment before meeting the camera again. "The night it happened, I thought I lost everything. My marriage, my dignity, my safety, my child. But what I didn't lose was the truth. And the truth has a way of surviving, even when you think you can't." The video was short, 5 minutes exactly, but it felt longer, like time had slowed to let her words sink in. When it was uploaded, no one expected what would happen next. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. News anchors played it on morning shows, talk hosts discussed it, and social media flooded with comments from people who saw themselves in her. Retired nurses, veterans, grandmothers, women who had once kept their own bruises hidden beneath long sleeves, all of them writing the same thing in different words. "I believe you." The story was no longer about a scandal or a millionaire's fall. It was about courage, and the way truth can bloom even in the ugliest soil. In the Whitman house, the television played quietly as the video reached 1 million views. Charles watched from his office doorway, his expression unreadable. He had spent years building companies, managing crises, controlling narratives. But this was different. This was his daughter's voice breaking through the noise, and no amount of strategy could have made it more powerful. Grace entered behind him, setting a cup of tea on his desk. "She didn't ask for your permission," she said softly. He gave a faint smile. "No," he replied, "and she didn't need it." For the first time in weeks, he looked less like a CEO and more like a father who understood that strength sometimes comes from letting go. Meanwhile, reporters gathered outside the hospital gates, not for scandal but for solidarity. Women held candles. Men carried signs that read "Justice for Claire." The footage of Ethan Hale's arrest had already circled the globe, but it was Claire's quiet voice that had truly changed the narrative. Inside her room, she scrolled through the messages one by one, her fingers trembling as she read the stories of strangers. Some messages were long confessions, others just a few words. "Thank you for speaking when I couldn't." It was overwhelming, almost unbearable in its beauty. The world had seen her at her weakest, but instead of shame, she felt something else rising in her, a sense of purpose she hadn't known she was capable of. Her doctor, Elise Brooks, entered quietly that afternoon, checking her chart. "You've started something, you know that?" she said. Claire looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" The doctor smiled. "They're calling it the Whitman movement. Survivors' foundations, hotlines, donations pouring in. You didn't just tell your story. You gave people permission to tell theirs." Claire stared at her for a moment, unsure how to react. "I didn't plan that," she whispered. Elise placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The best things aren't planned. They're just honest." Later that evening, Charles joined his daughter in the hospital garden. The air smelled of rain, and the lights from nearby buildings shimmered against the wet pavement. He carried his coat over one arm, his other hand holding a folded newspaper. "Front page," he said quietly, handing it to her. The headline read, "Claire Whitman's Voice Sparks National Reform." She glanced at it, then folded it back without reading. "I didn't do this for headlines," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why people listened." They sat together in silence for a while, the sound of wind in the trees filling the space between words. "You changed the story," he said finally. "You made them see you as more than a victim." She looked at him, her expression calm. "I'm not sure I changed anything. Maybe I just reminded them that the story isn't over yet." Across the country, talk shows and news outlets discussed the Whitman effect. Churches held vigils, schools organized awareness programs, and letters began arriving at the foundation that Charles had quietly begun funding in his daughter's name. Grace handled most of them, sorting through boxes of handwritten notes and photographs. One evening, she read one aloud to Claire. It was from a woman in her 70s, living alone in Kansas. "I saw your video. 50 years ago, I was you. I never spoke. But today, I told my granddaughter the truth." Claire pressed her hand to her mouth, tears pooling in her eyes. "That's why I did it," she whispered. That night, as the hospital dimmed and the hallways quieted, Claire sat by the window, her reflection overlapping with the city lights beyond. The baby kicked softly beneath her hand, a small rhythm of life that grounded her in the present. She thought of all the women whose names she would never know, all the stories that had been buried in silence and were now, somehow, finding their way to the surface. She didn't feel like a hero, she just felt human again. She reached for her phone, opened the video once more, and let it play in the dark. Hearing her own voice, steady, clear, and unafraid, made her realize something she hadn't before. She wasn't talking to the world. She had been talking to herself. When the screen went black, she didn't press replay. She simply sat there, listening to the hum of the city outside, the steady rhythm of her child's heartbeat on the monitor, the faint whisper of wind against the glass. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered like a quiet promise. She looked out at the city lights one last time before turning off the lamp. The room fell into a gentle darkness, not the kind that swallows, but the kind that rests. And for the first time since that night, Claire closed her eyes and slept without fear. The day the FBI arrived at Ethan Hale's office began like any other in downtown Los Angeles, with the city draped in a haze of golden morning light and the sound of traffic echoing between towers of glass. Inside the headquarters of Hale Global Properties, employees filed in carrying coffee cups and phones, unaware that their morning routine would soon turn into chaos. The elevators chimed softly, the reception desk gleamed, and in the boardroom on the top floor, Ethan stood before a wall of screens, his jaw tight, his reflection fractured into a dozen versions of himself. He had slept little, drunk too much, and convinced himself that control could still be salvaged if he spoke the right words to the right people. But deep down, he knew something was coming. The air felt heavier than usual, charged with the stillness that arrives right before a storm. He was pacing when the first black SUV pulled up outside the building, followed by two more, each one marked only by the discreet lettering of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At first, no one noticed. It was a large building, after all, with deliveries and clients arriving every hour. But when the men and women in navy jackets stepped out, their movements crisp, their expressions impassive, the front desk froze. One agent showed his badge. "Federal warrant. We need access to all company floors immediately." Within minutes, the hum of conversation turned into silence, replaced by the mechanical click of elevator doors and the low murmur of radio communication. Ethan's assistant, a young man named Jordan, burst into the boardroom, his face pale. "Sir, the FBI is here," he stammered. Ethan looked up, unblinking. "Here for what?" he asked, though the question sounded rhetorical, almost bitter. "They said they have a warrant," Jordan continued, his voice trembling. Ethan exhaled, adjusting his tie with the detached composure of a man who had practiced denial for years. "Tell them I'll cooperate," he said, his tone calm but hollow. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Call my attorney." By the time the agents reached the top floor, the atmosphere was electric with tension. The sound of footsteps echoed off the marble, and papers rustled like whispers of guilt. Agent Rodriguez, tall and unreadable, stepped into the room and handed Ethan a folded document. "Mr. Hale, this is a federal warrant for the seizure of all financial and communication records related to Hale Global and its subsidiaries." Ethan accepted the paper, his fingers steady but his knuckles white. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. "I've built this company from nothing." The agent met his gaze without flinching. "Then you should have built it on the law." "No." Downstairs, employees watched as agents moved through the offices, collecting hard drives, sealing boxes, and photographing documents. The sound of printer drawers opening, keyboards being unplugged, and footsteps moving with purpose filled the air. A secretary wept softly behind her desk. Another whispered, "Is he going to prison?" No one answered. The entire building felt like a living organism holding its breath. In his office, Ethan stood before the window, watching as the reflection of the city blurred behind the faint sheen of morning rain. From up there, Los Angeles looked small, almost fragile, a place built on illusions of permanence. He turned to see two agents removing his laptop, another scanning the contents of his safe. "Be careful with that," he said sharply. The agent didn't respond. "You have no idea who I am," Ethan continued, his voice rising slightly. "Do you think you can just walk in here and—" He stopped himself. For the first time in years, his authority didn't matter. No one was listening. When the agents finally let him out, the lobby had grown crowded with reporters. Cameras flashed like lightning. Questions flew through the air. "Mr. Hale, is it true your wife's testimony led to this? Did you falsify financial records? Are you pleading guilty?" Ethan kept walking, his face expressionless, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The flashbulbs stung his eyes, and for a moment he thought of the Christmas tree, the look on Claire's face as she fell, the sound of gasps echoing around the ballroom. It came back not as guilt but as memory, sharp and cold. Outside, the rain had started to fall harder, washing over the pavement, smearing the reflection of his name on the glass doors, as if the city itself was erasing him. Meanwhile, in the Whitman residence, Charles sat with Sarah Chen in his study, the glow of a muted news broadcast flickering across their faces. On the screen, the footage played on loop. Ethan Hale in handcuffs, escorted down the marble steps, his expression unreadable. "It's done," Sarah said quietly. Charles nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the screen. "It's justice," he replied, "but justice never feels clean." He turned the volume up slightly. The reporter was speaking now, her tone measured. "The arrest follows months of investigation into fraudulent accounts, offshore holdings, and insider trading within Hale Global. Sources confirm that witness statements, including testimony from his former assistant, led to the federal warrant." Charles's jaw tightened. "Ava kept her word," he murmured. "She did." At the hospital, Claire watched the same footage from her bed, her hands folded over the blanket. Her father had turned off his phone to avoid the calls from journalists, but she couldn't look away from the screen. When the image of Ethan's arrest appeared, she didn't smile or cry. She simply stared, her face calm, her breathing steady. Dr. Brooks entered the room, checking the monitors, then paused. "Do you want me to turn it off?" she asked gently. Claire shook her head. "No, I need to see it." The doctor nodded and left her alone. For a long moment, Claire just listened to the reporter's voice, the hum of the machines, the soft rhythm of her own heartbeat. Then, quietly, she whispered, "It's over." But even as she said it, she knew that closure was not something that arrived with headlines or handcuffs. It was quieter than that, slower, almost invisible. It came in the way she could finally breathe without fear. It came in the sound of her baby's heartbeat, steady and strong beneath her palm. It came in knowing that truth had finally spoken louder than power. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the quiet victory unfolding behind hospital walls. Cars splashed through puddles, horns blared in the distance, and the sky cleared slowly into a pale, forgiving blue. Claire closed her eyes, letting the light fall across her face. Somewhere downtown, Ethan Hale was sitting in a holding cell, his reflection trapped behind cold glass, the sound of the rain still lingering in his mind. And miles away, in a hospital room filled with warmth and quiet, Claire whispered to her unborn child, her voice steady, certain, and new, "You're safe now." That single sentence seemed to fill the room. The monitors hummed softly, the light shifted across the floor, and the world outside went on turning. For the first time since the night everything broke, there was no fear in her voice, no weight in her chest, just calm, just peace. the kind that doesn't need to be announced to be real. 6 months later, the courthouse stood under a sky washed clean by early summer rain, its marble steps gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. Reporters gathered near the entrance, microphones ready, their murmurs blending with the sound of traffic and the soft flutter of flags in the wind. Inside, the air was still, thick with the weight of expectation. Claire Whitman sat on the witness bench, her hands folded over a stack of papers, the faint cry of her newborn son echoing in the hallway outside. She wore a simple white dress, modest yet graceful, her posture calm but her eyes alert, steady, prepared. The courtroom was full, lawyers shuffling documents, cameras discreetly positioned near the back, members of the public leaning forward as if the verdict would change something in their own lives. And at the defense table sat Ethan Hale, in a gray suit that no longer carried the power it once did, his hair thinner, his face drawn. He looked not at Claire, but at the table before him, his hands gripping the edges as though the polished wood could keep him from unraveling. The judge entered, the room rising in unison. His gavel struck once, sharp and clean, and the quiet that followed felt heavier than any sound. The trial had lasted for weeks, filled with testimony, evidence, and cross-examinations that peeled away the glossy layers of a life built on deception. The financial crimes were damning enough: fraud, bribery, embezzlement, but it was the assault charge that silenced even the most jaded observers. The moment replayed on the screen again and again: the Christmas tree, the crowd, the kick, the fall. Each time the footage appeared, Claire could feel her stomach tighten, but she never looked away. She had learned that strength wasn't the absence of pain, but the decision to face it without flinching. Her lawyer, Sarah Chen, rose from the prosecution table, her voice steady, clear. "Your Honor, my client is not here for pity. She is here because truth deserves a place in this courtroom, because no amount of wealth or reputation can erase what was done to her." She paused, letting the silence stretch before turning toward Ethan. "And because justice means accountability, not revenge." The judge nodded slightly, his eyes flicking toward Claire. "Mrs. Whitman," he said, "you may speak." She stood slowly, one hand brushing against the edge of the table for balance, the other resting over her heart as if to keep it steady. Her voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering. "I never wanted any of this to happen," she began. "I married a man I loved. I believed in him, and for years I convinced myself that the pain was temporary, that the cruelty was stress, that love meant endurance. But when he raised his foot that night, when I saw the look in his eyes, I realized that love cannot survive fear." She paused, glancing briefly at Ethan, who kept his gaze down. "I'm not here to destroy him," she continued quietly. "I'm here to make sure that no one else believes silence is survival." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even the reporters stopped typing. For a brief moment, everyone seemed to hold the same breath, the same understanding that some truths don't need amplification, they simply need to exist. Sarah placed a hand on Claire's shoulder as she sat back down, her eyes glistening but composed. Across the aisle, Ethan's attorney rose, trying to salvage what little remained. "My client regrets his actions deeply," he said, his tone rehearsed but hollow. "He has suffered significant loss, financially, emotionally, socially." The judge cut him off. "Sit down, counselor." The verdict came swiftly after that. Guilty on all charges. 17 years without parole for the financial crimes, and 5 more for the assault. When the gavel struck, the sound was final, almost merciful in its simplicity. Ethan's shoulders slumped, his hands unclasped, and for the first time, he turned toward Claire. His expression was not anger, but something far more complex: regret, fear, disbelief, maybe even longing for the life he had shattered with his own hands. Claire met his eyes only once, not to condemn but to confirm that she no longer felt anything at all. The chapter had closed. Outside the courthouse, sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, casting streaks of gold across the city's stone facade. Reporters swarmed, questions flying like sparks. "Claire, how do you feel? What will you do next? Do you forgive him?" She didn't answer. Her father shielded her with one arm, guiding her down the steps as cameras flashed. "Let's go home," Charles said softly. She nodded, holding her baby closer, the warmth of his tiny body grounding her in the present. Grace was waiting by the car, tears glistening in her eyes, her hand covering her mouth as Claire approached. "It's over," she whispered. Claire smiled faintly. "Yes, it is." That evening, the house was filled with a quiet that felt sacred. The television was off. The phones silenced. The only sound, the soft rhythm of rain beginning again outside. Charles sat in his study, staring out the window at the city lights, while Grace rocked the baby gently by the fireplace. Claire stood near the doorway, watching them, feeling the fragile peace of a family that had been broken but not destroyed. She thought of all the faces she had seen in court, the women who had come to watch, the men who had nodded in silent understanding, the strangers who had written to her. She thought of her own reflection months ago, trembling and afraid, and realized that she barely recognized that woman anymore. Later, as the rain grew heavier, she stepped outside onto the porch, the night air cool against her skin. The garden was alive with the scent of wet earth, and the city's distant hum felt softer now, less intrusive. She closed her eyes and listened. The world hadn't changed, but she had. The noise no longer owned her. The fear no longer defined her. Behind her, the baby stirred, a small cry breaking through the night. She turned back inside, lifting him into her arms, his tiny fingers wrapping instinctively around hers. "You see?" she whispered, smiling through tears. "We made it." The fire crackled softly in the background as she settled into the armchair by the window. Outside, the rain glowed under the streetlights, falling in steady, silver lines. She could hear her father moving somewhere down the hall, his footsteps unhurried, his voice low as he spoke to Grace. For the first time in a long while, there was no tension in those sounds, no anger or fear hidden beneath the surface, only peace. Claire leaned back, letting her son's heartbeat rest against hers, and breathed deeply. The scent of milk, rain, and wood smoke filled the air, grounding her in the simple truth of being alive. When the clock struck 9, she looked out at the city one last time, watching as the courthouse lights dimmed in the distance. The storm had passed, the noise had faded, and somewhere between the quiet hum of the house and the gentle rise and fall of her son's breathing, Claire found the kind of stillness she had once thought impossible. She closed her eyes, her lips forming a silent prayer of gratitude, not for justice, not for victory, but for survival. The night deepened, the world outside shimmering with rain, and in that moment, she understood that peace was not the absence of pain, but the courage to live beyond it. The morning sun rose over the city with a quiet brilliance, washing the skyline in soft shades of gold and blue. 6 months had passed since the verdict, and yet, for Claire Whitman, time had not simply healed, it had reshaped her. The old rhythm of fear had been replaced by something slower, gentler, more deliberate. In the heart of downtown stood a new building, sleek and luminous, its glass walls reflecting both light and hope. The sign above the entrance read, "The Whitman Foundation," the letters carved in silver, surrounded by blooming white lilies and soft sky-blue ribbons fluttering in the breeze. Inside, the lobby was alive with warmth, volunteers arranging boxes of supplies, children laughing as they played near the reception desk, and reporters quietly preparing for the foundation's grand opening ceremony. There was a kind of reverent stillness in the air, as if everyone understood that this place had been born not out of wealth, but out of survival. Claire stood near the podium, her light blue dress catching the morning light like a reflection of the sky itself. Her posture was calm but steady, the quiet confidence of a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ruins of pain. Her hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and in her arms she held her baby boy, now a few months old, his eyes wide with wonder at the crowd before them. She smiled down at him, whispering something only he could hear, before looking up to see her parents standing nearby. Charles and Grace watched her with pride and awe, their hands intertwined, as though afraid that if they let go, the moment would slip away. "You look beautiful," Grace whispered when Claire approached. Claire smiled softly. "I feel alive." Her father chuckled quietly, though his eyes shimmered with emotion. "You look like your mother did the day we opened our first office," he said. "Except you've built something far more important." As guests began to take their seats, the hum of voices filled the hall. Photographers adjusted their lenses, reporters flipped open their notebooks, and somewhere in the back, An elderly woman held a sign that read, "Hope begins here." The words made Claire's throat tighten. She took a deep breath, passed her baby gently into her mother's arms, and stepped up to the podium. The murmur faded as microphones adjusted, and the audience settled into silence. She looked around, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, faces of survivors, donors, friends, strangers, all connected by one shared truth. Pain can be transformed into purpose. "Thank you," she began, her voice soft but sure. "A year ago, I stood in a courtroom, shaking and terrified, wondering if I would ever feel whole again. And yet, today, I stand before you, not as a victim, but as a mother, a daughter, and a survivor. This building," she paused, glancing up at the gleaming glass walls, "is not just a foundation, it's a promise that no one should ever have to face silence alone." Her words hung in the air like a prayer. "For too long, I believed that strength meant hiding my pain. But true strength is the courage to share it, to let others see the cracks, and to help them realize that they're not broken either." Applause rippled through the room, not loud, but heartfelt, the kind that carried warmth rather than noise. Claire smiled, pressing her hand briefly to her chest before continuing. "This foundation will offer legal aid, counseling, and shelter for survivors of abuse and families rebuilding their lives. But beyond that, it will offer something even more powerful: belonging. Because healing begins the moment someone looks at you and says, 'I believe you.'" Her voice trembled slightly on the last words, and she let the silence stretch before speaking again, her tone quieter now, more intimate. "To my family, who stood by me when I couldn't stand on my own, and to my son, whose heartbeat reminded me that life was still worth fighting for, this is for you." "No." As she stepped back from the podium, the applause rose again, stronger this time, carrying through the open glass doors and out into the city. Charles was the first to reach her, wrapping his arms around his daughter, his voice rough with emotion. "You did it," he whispered. Claire leaned into his embrace, closing her eyes for a moment, feeling the solidity of the man who had once been her shield and was now her partner in hope. "We did it," she corrected softly. Grace joined them, cradling the baby as she smiled through tears. "He'll grow up knowing what courage looks like," she said, brushing a strand of hair from Claire's face. The rest of the morning unfolded in gentle rhythm. Reporters interviewed volunteers, guests toured the new counseling rooms and play areas, and in every corner of the building, the sound of laughter mixed with the soft background of piano music. Claire stood by the large glass window overlooking the city, her reflection merging with the skyline. She felt the sunlight on her skin and, for the first time, didn't flinch from it. "Are you ready for the press photos?" Sarah Chen asked, approaching with her usual composed smile. "Just one more minute," Claire replied, her gaze still on the horizon. "I just want to remember this exactly as it is." Hub. Outside, a light breeze stirred the ribbons tied to the entrance sign, making them dance like soft waves of color against the silver letters. People paused to take photos, some placing flowers at the steps, others leaving handwritten notes of gratitude. One note caught Claire's eye later that afternoon, a simple card that read, "Because you spoke, I found my voice." She traced the words with her finger, her heart swelling with quiet pride. It wasn't fame or recognition she felt, but peace, the kind that came from knowing she had turned her pain into something that might save someone else's tomorrow. As the sun began to set, the building glowed with a warm amber light. The reflection of the sky made the glass shimmer like water, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed as if the whole city was breathing with her, steady, alive, renewed. Claire walked outside, her baby now asleep in her arms, and stood at the base of the foundation steps. Her father joined her, slipping his coat over her shoulders as the evening air cooled. "You've built more than a foundation," he said quietly. "You've built a legacy." Claire smiled, watching the last light fade behind the skyline. "Maybe," she replied, "but it feels more like a beginning." "Huh." They stood there for a long time, saying nothing more, listening to the faint sound of traffic and the laughter of volunteers closing up inside. Above them, the building lights remained on, casting a soft blue glow across the steps, a color that had followed Claire from her darkest night to her brightest day. She looked down at her son's sleeping face and whispered, almost to herself, "You'll never know the fear I did, only the strength that came after." Lo! The city lights flickered to life one by one, blending into the deepening dusk. Claire took a final look at the foundation sign, the silver letters gleaming beneath the sky's last shade of blue. Then she turned toward home, her child nestled close, her footsteps steady, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Behind her, the building stood like a quiet monument to everything she had endured and everything she had become, a reminder that sometimes, from the ruins of the past, something radiant and unbreakable can finally rise. A full year had passed since the night the world watched Ethan Hale's empire collapse, and yet the memory still lingered in quiet places, the way thunder echoes long after the storm is gone. Los Angeles woke that morning to a soft light, the kind that makes glass buildings shimmer like water. The city, always in motion, seemed to pause for a moment, as if exhaling after holding its breath for too long. There were no headlines about courtrooms or scandals now. No crowds outside hospitals or towers. Only the hum of normal life returning, steady and unremarkable, which was precisely what made it beautiful. At the corner of 5th and Hill, a new building stood where one of Hale's abandoned projects had once been. The structure was made entirely of white stone and glass, gleaming in the sunlight. Its sign read, "The Grace Foundation," etched in silver and surrounded by soft blue flowers that curved along the entrance steps. Inside, the air was warm with the scent of fresh paint and lilies. Volunteers moved between tables, arranging boxes of books and care kits. Children's laughter echoed down the marble hallway, filling the space with a sound that felt like healing. It was opening day, a celebration not of money or power, but of renewal. Claire Whitman stood near the podium at the front of the hall, her posture graceful, her expression calm. Her light blue dress shimmered faintly, catching the sunlight through the high glass ceiling. In her arms, she held her son, Noah, now 1 year old, his small fingers gripping the edge of her necklace as he looked curiously at the crowd. He had her eyes, soft and searching, and the same quiet resilience that had carried her through the darkest nights. When the guests began to settle, she handed him gently to her mother, then stepped forward. The room hushed instantly, the buzz of movement falling into expectant silence. "Thank you for being here," she began, her voice steady, her tone carrying a warmth that filled the room. "A year ago, I thought my life had ended. I thought the best parts of me were gone, buried beneath the pain and the fear. But standing here today, I realize that endings and beginnings can look the same when you're standing in the middle of them." Her gaze moved across the crowd, pausing on familiar faces, survivors, supporters, and strangers who had found hope through her story. This foundation isn't just about what we've lost, it's about what we can build from the ashes of what tried to break us. Applause rose softly, sincere and unhurried. Charles and Grace stood near the back, watching their daughter with a mixture of pride and awe. Charles, who had spent decades building skyscrapers and businesses, had never built anything that meant as much as this. Grace wiped her eyes, whispering to him, "She did it." He nodded, voice low. "No, she became it." On the far wall, a mural stretched from floor to ceiling, an abstract blend of blues and whites depicting a hand reaching upward toward light. At the bottom were engraved words that Claire had chosen herself. "Out of pain, we rise." After the ceremony, the hall filled with conversation and laughter. People shared stories, took photos, and left messages of gratitude on a long white board near the exit. Claire moved through the crowd, smiling, greeting everyone with genuine warmth. When she reached the corner where the reporters waited, she answered their questions calmly, each response grounded in humility. "Do you see yourself as an activist now?" one of them asked. She smiled faintly. "No, just someone who finally stopped being afraid to speak." Another asked if she had forgiven Ethan. There was a pause before she replied, "Forgiveness isn't a gift you give someone else. It's what you give yourself when you're ready to live again." Later, when the guests had left and the building had quieted, Claire walked alone through the main hall. The sunlight had shifted, turning the marble floors into mirrors of gold. She stopped at the staircase near the back, the one modeled after the grand staircase in her old home. the place where her life had once shattered. She climbed each step slowly, her fingers trailing along the smooth rail. At the fifth step, she stopped. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the silence. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small bouquet of light blue flowers. Kneeling, she placed them gently on the step. "For everything that ended," she whispered, "and everything that began." Downstairs, the faint cry of her son echoed, pulling her back to the present. She descended, smiling as she found Grace soothing the child with quiet patience. "He's growing fast," Grace said. Claire nodded. "Too fast." Her father approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You know," he said softly, "this place feels like you. Strong, honest, unbreakable." Claire smiled, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not unbreakable, Dad. It just keeps getting rebuilt." That evening, after the crowd had gone and the sun began to set, Claire stood outside with her family. The city lights flickered to life one by one, reflecting off the glass facade of the building. The air was cool, the sky painted with streaks of pink and lavender. In her arms, Noah stirred, pressing his cheek against her shoulder. She looked down at him, then up at the glowing letters of the foundation's name. "One day," she said softly, "you'll know what this means." Charles stood beside her, his arm around Grace, his voice quiet. "He'll know," he said, "because he'll grow up in a world you helped change." Claire turned to him, smiling. "I didn't change the world, Dad. I just decided to stop letting it break me." They watched as the last light faded from the sky, leaving the building bathed in a gentle blue glow. Inside, the volunteers were still cleaning up, their laughter faint but steady. As the evening deepened, Claire walked back inside one last time. The hall was nearly empty now, the air still holding the echoes of the day. She stood in the center, listening. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city carried on, sirens, laughter, distant music. But here, in this quiet space she had built from the fragments of her past, there was only peace. She closed her eyes, letting the sound of her son's breathing reach her from across the room. It was soft, rhythmic, alive, a promise that life would go on, not perfectly, but beautifully. When she stepped outside again, the night had fully arrived. The streetlights cast long reflections across the pavement, and the foundation's sign gleamed against the dark like a beacon. Claire paused, taking in the view, the city below, her family beside her. The world still imperfect, but undeniably hers. "Ready to go home?" Charles asked. She nodded, adjusting the blanket around Noah. "Yes," she said quietly. "We're already there." They walked toward the car together, their footsteps slow, their silhouettes blending into the golden light of the street. Behind them, the Grace Foundation stood glowing against the night, a living monument not to tragedy, but to transformation. Inside its glass walls, the faint scent of blue flowers lingered in the air, and the echo of laughter promised that even in the quietest corners of loss, something beautiful can still bloom.